Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Price, and I'll be your instructor for Biology 102. Welcome to the class. In this course, we'll be learning about the diversity of organisms found on the planet. There are currently almost 2 million described species, and many more waiting to be discovered. We start out this course with the study of evolution, since that is the process through which all of this really amazing diversity evolved. Next, we'll be learning about all the different exciting kinds of organisms found on the planet that inhabit almost every environment on Earth. While you listen to these videos, be sure to take notes. Taking notes and writing down concepts in your own words is a tried and true method for learning and understanding the material very well. I try to go at a good pace for taking notes, but if it's too fast for you, you can always pause the video while you're writing, and you can always back up a little bit. I've broken up these videos into short segments. Most are around 15 to 30 minutes long. It's a good idea to try to watch one video every day. That way you'll get a few days off in some weeks and you'll make sure to never get behind. If you have a busy schedule at work, it's pretty easy to fit in 20 or 30 minutes at the end of the day to work on a class. Or you can listen during your lunch break or while you're eating breakfast. Throughout this course, I also ask my students to interact with the video themselves. There are a lot of questions that I ask students, not only to review the material, but to think about what they've learned and apply it to different concepts and different situations. Practicing these questions will help you prepare for tests and help you to understand and remember the material that you're working on while you're listening to the video. So thank you for taking my course, and let's get started learning about evolution. So we're going to focus on the discovery of evolution made by the famous scientist Charles Darwin. We'll focus on the ideas that were around before Darwin's time and how his theory differed from previous theories of how species were formed. Charles Darwin published his famous publication, The Origin of Species, in 1859. This was a revolutionary turning point in science that spurred lots of additional research and changed the way that scientists thought about biology. His ideas focused on the amazing diversity of organisms, but also the fact that even though there are so many different kinds of organisms, there are certain features and structures that they all have in common. His ideas included the idea that species that are around today are the descendants of ancestral species that lived long ago, and that those species were somewhat different in structure and function than what we see today. Darwin used the phrase descent with modification to describe the process of evolution. And we can consider evolution to be both a pattern and a process. So we'll be learning about the patterns that Darwin observed in the natural world, in the fossil record, and even the patterns in geology, or rocks and continents that Darwin observed. And we'll also be talking about the processes involved in evolution that brought about all the changes and are responsible for the amazing diversity of life that we see today. So let's start with talking about some of the ideas that were around before Darwin's time. Okay? Even though Darwin came up with some great theories, and advanced the study of evolution to a great deal, he certainly was influenced by scientists that came before him. One of the earliest scientists to address the classification of species was the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle lived a few thousand years ago, before the birth of Christ. He believed that the species were fixed and they didn't change over time, that God had created all species exactly as they are today. But he was one of the first to attempt to classify the different species based on their complexity. So he came up with a system that he called Scala Naturae, That literally means the scale of nature in Latin. And he arranged them in a linear format from the simplest to the most complex. And every new species that was discovered would be placed somewhere in between other species on this linear scale. The scale ranged from the simplest organisms, bacteria with very simple cells, all the way up to the most complex, humans. Another important naturalist who influenced Darwin's thinking was Carolus Linnaeus. He had some of the same ideas as Darwin. He observed adaptations or traits that organisms have that make them well suited to their environment. His ideas were different from Darwin's because he thought that these adaptations were evidence of God's creation. A good creator would make the organisms suitable for a particular environment and having structures that worked well to ensure the survival and the future reproduction of these organisms. Although the theories that Linnaeus has put forth about creation have changed a great deal, we still use some of his principles in modern-day science. He's considered the founder of the science of taxonomy. That's still a branch of science that we use today, and it's concerned with classifying organisms. Instead of using a linear scale like Aristotle did, he created categories that fit in other types of categories used for classifying organisms. He also developed the system of giving scientific or Latin names to different species. This is called binomial nomenclature. Binomial refers to the fact that each species name has two parts. Bi refers to two, and nomial refers to the name of an organism. Throughout this course, if you can learn what different prefixes at the beginning of words, different suffixes at the ends of words, and a lot of these Latin and Greek root words, it'll make the vocabulary a lot easier to remember. And binomial is a good example. The two parts of the word binomial literally mean two names. So an example of one of these binomial names would be the scientific name for humans, Homo sapiens. Homo, the first part, is the genus name, and sapiens refers to a specific species within the genus Homo. Some genera, that's the plural of genus, contain many different species, and others, like the humans, have only one surviving member. In addition to ideas about how species arose and how to classify species, other important ideas that influenced Darwin's thinking were not only in the field of biology, but in geology. The study of fossils was very important in influencing Darwin's ideas that species change over time. Knowing the history and finding organisms that have been fossilized was a way that scientists can compare modern-day species to species that lived long ago and to study the types of changes that occurred. Fossils are simply remains or traces of organisms that lived in the distant past. They could be bones, or they could be things like the whole organism frozen in ice, or sometimes they're simply impressions left in mud or hot lava that show the shape of the organism. Most types of fossils are found in sedimentary rock. That is rock that's formed from the aggregation or the cementing together of small pieces of rock, sand, dust, and other materials. And sedimentary rock forms layers, one layer upon another. The older layers tend to be found deeper beneath the surface, and the newer layers are deposited on top of the other layers. This makes it possible to gauge how old some fossils are relative to one another, which of course is very important in studying evolution. The science of the study of fossils is called paleontology. Before Darwin's time, a scientist named Georges Cuvier developed this field. He thought that each boundary between the different strata, or the layers of sedimentary rocks, represented a mass extinction. Okay, he thought that a long time ago, when the Earth first came into existence, that there were many more species than there are today. And he thought that instead of new species developing over time, that species were lost over time, and that each time a mass extinction event occurred, the total number of species on Earth was reduced. So he opposed the idea of species changing over time, but as we'll learn later in the course, he was correct that from time to time, mass extinction events do occur in which a large fraction of the species on Earth go extinct in a relatively short period of time. Darwin was also influenced by the geologists, James Hutton and Charles Lyell. They published their work in the 1700s and the early 1800s, before and around the time that Darwin was born. They proposed that the geological features that we see on continents today were not always the same as they are now. That over time, these geological features changed due to things like erosion, the cutting through riverbeds, and other processes that would gradually wear away at rocks over time. Other processes, like volcanoes, would create new rocks at the Earth's surface from material deep within the Earth's core. An important piece of evidence or another important theory that these two scientists proposed was that because these processes take such a long time, the Earth is a lot older than 6,000 years old. Now, what's magical about the number 6,000 years old? Well, that's the approximate age of the Earth as determined by events in the Bible. So before Charles Lyell and James Hutton, many people believed that the Earth was 6,000 years old. And these two scientists were some of the first to propose that it's much older and these processes have been going on for a much longer period of time. So, knowing that the Earth was very old and that so many things about the Earth and about all the environments that the species on Earth would be experiencing change slowly over a long period of time influenced Darwin's thinking to a great deal. Another biologist who proposed a theory about evolution before Darwin was Lamarck. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck hypothesized that species evolved through using some body parts more than others and using other body parts less. He proposed a theory called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Acquired refers to the fact that these organisms developed or picked up certain traits during their lifetime, and that the more they changed during their lifetime, the more they would pass those traits on to the next generation. An example that he used was the giraffe's neck. He thought that because the giraffe was reaching high up in the trees to reach the leaves that it ate, that it stretched its neck out over time, and the neck got slightly longer every time the giraffe stretched it. He then proposed that the offspring of giraffes with really long necks would also have very long necks as well, and that over time the neck would get longer and longer. We now know that the mechanisms that he proposed were not supported by evidence, and for the most part they've been proven false. Okay, we know that if you change an organism during its lifetime, like this gardener here, who's working with a bonsai tree, and causing it to grow to a small size and causing its branches to bend in a certain way, that the offspring are not going to inherit those traits. Okay, the offspring of the seeds of the bonsai plant are perfectly capable of growing to a typical larger size if they were grown in a different environment. So even though Lamarck wasn't correct about the mechanisms, his ideas were very important because he challenged those who believed that species were fixed and didn't change over time. Certainly, reading about Lamarck's ideas and thinking about how he proposed that species changed over time, based on their environment, was certainly influential in Darwin's thinking.